highly successful. Nobody's successful today in Zimbabwe unless you're a friend of Mugabe. You know, he's got a bunch of cronies who get, lots of government stuff, but nobody else is doing anything other than that. Whereas the white minority rule was perfectly content because they believed in that. The blacks who took over believed in communism. Mugabe, when he was running his rebellion against the Rhodesian government, was having a great deal of trouble, mostly because the black Rhodesians would turn in the black anti-government activists to the governmental authorities. And so Mugabe went to China and met with Mao Zedong and told about the problem that we keep getting turned in by our own guys. And Mao Zedong said, you got to teach them communism. Okay? You can't just get them to be anti-government activists. First, educate them in communism, and once they get into the communist movement, then they'll be loyal, and there won't be a problem. And that's what he did. For the next 10 years, he spent his time, teaching communism, and so it's that system which has caused the problem. And that answers another question you might have, which is how come democracy seems to have worked in some cases? Why are there countries where you vote and it's turned out okay? And I think the answer is very simple. If you have a country where the majority believes in capitalism, it will work because they'll vote for laws and governments that believe in capitalism, and you will have capitalism. That's not because democracy works, it's because capitalism works. Okay? You could have a complete, absolute dictatorship, but let's say this particular dictator, so there's no voting, no political rights at all, one guy runs the country and his word is law, and that's it. Imagine that situation. If this particular dictator is a big believer in capitalism, I would suggest to you the country would thrive economically. Did you know that in the 60s and 70s, black people from other countries in Africa snuck in to Rhodesia because they wanted to live there?
In South Africa.
And South Africa too. Because, it's like when Rhodesia went from being the most prosperous country in the world to a hellhole. It was also, by the way, the breadbasket of Africa. It produced food that fed the rest of the continent. Now they're starving because the farms aren't producing anything anymore. The white liberals in the West were like, well, we've done our work here. Let's move on to the next country. And the next country they moved on to is South Africa. Do you know how much the U.S. economy shrunk during the Great Recession of 2008? Let's say if you start from before this recession began, the housing market collapsed, and went to the trough at the bottom, how much did our economy shrink in what is the biggest recession since the Great Depression in the 30s? Anyone know? Anyone want to take a guess? How much our economy shrunk?
2.5%.
About 5%.
Yeah.
So, not annualized, about 5% net contraction. Do you know how much the South African economy has contracted between when apartheid ended and today? 25%. Okay? The biggest recession we've had in our entire lifetime is a 5% contraction. Their economy has shrunk 25% over the same period. Again, not because of the racial issues per se, but that you've replaced people who fundamentally believed in capitalism from people who fundamentally don't believe in capitalism, because it's capitalism, not democracy, that makes a society prosperous. And by the way, we see this today in places like China, where the government there's no voting, there's no political freedom at all, and yet they decided to try and experiment with free markets and capitalism, and in Shazam, you've got prosperity. The Chinese economy, while our economy and the South African economy and the Rhodesian economy have been shrinking, they're booming because they're trying capitalism. Interestingly, without democracy, and don't get me wrong, I believe in political freedom. I don't think we want to live in a country where there's zero political freedom. Arguably, my entire life is about political freedom. But I'm just pointing out that political freedom is not necessary for prosperity. You can have prosperity without political freedom. You can see this also in for example, the early days of the Roman Empire. What you need is free markets and capitalism, and you need whoever is in a position to make these decisions to be people who are committed to this model.
Well,
yes,
the argument is that without political freedom, eventually you will not have economic freedom.
that is probably true.
Because the principle of robbery and politics go hand in hand.
Sure, and to the extent, and I agree with you, to this extent, that the people who believe in capitalism but not political freedom will eventually become corrupted and they'll take advantage of the fact they have power. But here's the problem. The same thing happens in a democratic system.
Mm-hmm.
Hans Hoppe, I don't know if you guys run into him at all, and he's a retired Austrian economist from Nevada. He wrote a book a couple of years ago called "Democracy: The God That Failed." And I'm not necessarily endorsing this opinion, but here's what he says.
So he's obviously making an allusion to the famous anti-communist collection.
He says that monarchy arguably works better than democracy because of the incentives involved. He says that if you have a king, the king in effect owns the country. That's what monarchy is. You're his subjects, he is the king, it is his country. And that in such a model, he, the king, has a huge incentive to keep the country as healthy as possible. Because it's his country. It's going to be his country for the rest of his life, and when he dies, he wants to pass that country onto his son, who's going to be the next king. Okay? It's just like any other property that's owned. The king has an incentive to make his country as healthy and positive as possible. Whereas in a democracy, where you have a party that's temporarily in power, they don't have that incentive. They know they're going to be out of power someday. They're in power now. They're not going to be out of power at some point after the next election or the election after that. They have every incentive to loot the country in every way they possibly can. Let's grab all the money we can and run, because we know the other party's going to get there. And moreover, Hoppe says, that the other party, you might think has an incentive to try to stop them, but it actually doesn't, because the other party knows that its turn's going to come, that at some point in the future it's going to be the party in power, and why should we speak out about their looting the country? If we just wait patiently, we'll win an election, it'll be our turn to loot the country.
So it seems like Gaddafi,
Yes.
Gaddafi and the Iraqi guy, they treated the country like theirs, and they made it prosperous.
Well, I'm not sure if they made it prosperous. That would probably be an exaggeration. I'm not, certainly in Gaddafi's case, and probably in Saddam Hussein's case also. I'm not entirely agreeing with Hoppe. All I'm suggesting is that it's the principle of capitalism that neither Gaddafi nor Saddam Hussein really were believers in that makes the country prosperous. I got two more things to share with you, and if there's questions, I'm happy to answer.